Okay, what if I told you that the person you trust the absolute most in the world, the one you've rewarded, confided in, and promoted, might actually be the single biggest threat to your success? Sounds crazy, right? Maybe a little paranoid? I mean, we're all taught from day one to value loyalty, to surround ourselves with friends, and to expect that if we're kind to people, they'll be grateful. But what if that entire sentimental view of loyalty is actually a massive trap?
Okay, let's dive right into this. In today's explainer, we're breaking down one of the most fiercely debated, totally counterintuitive ideas from Robert Greene's The 48 Laws of Power. We're talking about Law 2, never put too much trust in friends, learn how to use enemies. Greene basically argues that friendship is the absolute most unreliable foundation you could possibly have for power. It's a huge claim, I know, but as we're going to see through both history and human psychology, there is actually a chilling logic to it. Here's the roadmap for this explainer. We're going to cover the illusion of friendship, a fatal historic mistake, the master strategist's playbook, the power of enemies, and finally, exceptions to the rule. Let's kick things off with Section 1, the illusion of friendship.
So look, we usually see our friends as our safe harbor, right? They make the cutthroat world feel a little softer. We hire them, we promote them because, well, they make us comfortable. But Greene argues that very comfort is exactly what completely ruins our judgment. Think about it. Friendship naturally runs on emotion. It requires mutual flattery, kind of hiding the ugly truths. Elevate a friend, and suddenly their hidden qualities bubble up. They get envious. And those favors you gave them, they actually breed entitlement. Now, completely flip that and think about former enemies. They operate purely on mutual interest. They have everything to prove, and they expect literally nothing. The relationship is completely transactional, and ironically, that makes it way more stable and predictable than friendship.
Greene actually has this wild image for it. He calls it the jaws of ingratitude. Think about it. You would never just stick your bare finger in a lion's mouth, right? But with friends, we just totally ignore the danger. It's a psychological trap. We just assume that doing a favor builds lasting loyalty. But the reality, gratitude is actually a really heavy burden. Most people eventually grow to resent it. The favor starts to feel oppressive. The friend feels like they were picked just because you like them, not because they're actually good at the job. And not resentment, it will absolutely devour you. Which brings us to Section 2, a fatal, historic mistake. To really see how bad this can get, we're going back to the mid-9th century Byzantine Empire for a story that seriously plays out exactly like a true crime thriller. So picture this, young Emperor Michael III. He's totally inexperienced, surrounded by all this crazy court drama, and he just desperately needs someone he can trust. So what does he do? He ignores all the qualified advisors and promotes his absolute best friend, Basilius. This guy was literally a peasant stable groom who happened to save Michael from a wild horse once. Michael showers him with unimaginable wealth, fancy titles, and even marries him off to his own mistress. He figured this avalanche of favors meant they were bonded for life. Yeah, no. Exposure to that much power just flipped a switch in Basilius. First, he talks Michael into murdering his own uncle. Then, he takes total control of the army. When Michael finally wakes up to what's happening and asks for some of his money back, Basilius basically just laughs in his face. And the grand finale? The former stable boy assassinates Michael while he's drunk and literally parades his severed head through the streets on a pike. Michael's emotional attachment completely blinded him to the monster he was creating. The source actually ties this whole disaster to an ancient African folktale about a snake, a farmer, and a heron. The whole point of the story is to highlight this really dark human pattern. Kindness is so often repaid with injury, just like we saw with Michael and Basilius. Assuming that favors buy loyalty in the real world, it's just self-deception. So that leaves us with a pretty intense cliffhanger. If your closest circle is prone to envy, and if doing favors just breeds resentment, I mean, if friends are actually this dangerous, who on earth can you trust to help you succeed? Let's find out in Section 3, the Master Strategist's Playbook. Let's pivot from disasters to actual, actionable strategy. We're looking at a guy who solved this exact problem, and honestly, it's brilliant. Emperor Song, taking over China in 959 AD. Now, Sung stepped into a totally chaotic system where generals were constantly murdering emperors to steal the throne. He knew his biggest threat wasn't an invading army. It was his own fellow commanders, his friends, who helped him get to the top. So he throws a massive banquet. He dismisses all the guards, looks his powerful buddies dead in the eye, and calls out their ambition.
Then he gives them a choice. You can keep your commands and live in absolute terror that I'm going to have to execute you, or you resign right now, take a massive pile of gold, move to a gorgeous estate, and live out your days in absolute luxury. Literally the next day, every single one of them resigned. Sung neutralized his greatest threats, let them keep their dignity, and broke a centuries-old cycle of violence without spilling a single drop of blood. But here is where Sung was a true genius, how he handled his actual enemies. When a rebel king surrendered to him, Sung gave him a fancy title and then drank from a shared cup of wine, but he drank first, just to prove it wasn't poisoned. Later on, he caught another defeated king actively plotting against him. What does Sung do? He honors the guy in public, and then in private just quietly hands him the secret documents proving the treason. He's basically saying, I have your life in my hands, and I'm choosing to let you live. Both of these former enemies turned into his most fiercely loyal supporters. Why? Because when you spare someone from total ruin, they owe you a massive, tangible debt. And that's something a comfortable friend is never going to feel. And this brilliantly illustrates a quote from the philosopher Balthazar Gracian that's featured in the text. He says, "Know how to use enemies for your own profit. The wise man profits more from his enemies than a fool from his friends." It's all about grabbing the sword by the handle, not the blade, you know?
Moving on to Section 4, the power of enemies.
Okay, so how do we actually use this today? Whether you're navigating office politics or running a business, the playbook is pretty clear. First off, keep your friends for your personal life. When it comes to getting things done, you hire for skill, period. Competence literally always has to beat out affection. The text argues that working relationships actually need a bit of distance because intimacy totally clouds your judgment. Also, a little conflict, it's not a bad thing. It sharpens your focus, keeps you from getting lazy. In fact, Greene goes as far as saying that if you don't have any obvious enemies, you might actually need to go out and create some. Seriously, it unifies your team and gives everyone a shared purpose. Because honestly, vague ambiguity is way more dangerous than a clear, open rival. And you see this dynamic playing out over and over across history. The French diplomat Talleyrand, he needed a partner he could trust to plot against Napoleon. So who does he pick? His absolute worst enemy, a guy who had literally tried to have him killed. Because they didn't trust each other, the partnership was rock solid. You see the same thing with Henry Kissinger charming his declared opponents for diplomatic wins, or even Mao Zedong using the very real threat of a Japanese invasion to unite and train his own forces. Leaning into the transactional, predictable nature of an adversary, it's just a highly effective way to operate. Finally, let's look at Section 5, exceptions to the rule. Now, I know this all sounds incredibly cynical. It's meant to describe what actually works, not what's morally right. But there are a few very specific strategic exceptions, times when a friend is exactly who you need. The text calls this the reversal. Sometimes leaders need dirty work done, stuff they absolutely cannot be caught doing themselves. That's when a friend comes in really handy. Friends also make incredibly convenient scapegoats when things go horribly wrong. It's that classic fall of the favorite maneuver. And it works perfectly because the general public will never believe that a leader would intentionally throw their best friend under the bus. But you have to remember the cost here. If you pull this move, you are permanently destroying that friendship. So the main lesson still holds up. Power dynamics are super unstable. And even if you do bring a friend into the mix, you can't ever let your guard down. So at the end of the day, Law 2 is really telling us that power is a pretty lonely game. The comfort of having your friends around at work is great, but as a tool for actual success, it's massively flawed. Competence, mutual interest, and even former enemies are just way more reliable. So take a look at your own life. Look at your office, your professional circle. If bringing emotion into the mix actually confuses things, you've got to ask yourself, are you actively managing a smart, strategic portfolio of relationships? Or by just surrounding yourself with buddies, are you just sitting there waiting to be devoured? Definitely something to think about.